Hello and welcome everyone. This is third and concluding lecture on Marx, and in the previous two lectures we have discussed his theory on historical materialism and also his views on alienation, exploitation, and also particularly we emphasized on his views on class and state, and how he argued that the class or the proletariat as a class is the agent of change from capitalist mode of production to the communism, which is the next stage of life. Today in this concluding lecture we will begin with discussing his views on politics and also his understanding of communism. And in the second part of the lecture today we will focus on the critical aspect of his thought and various criticism that is labeled against Marx's political thought. And before concluding today, we will also try to understand the enduring legacy of Marx's thought and philosophy in the modern world and how it helps us to understand many of the challenges such as socio-economic disparities that we often come across within the nation, within the locality and also at the global level. So, the resources are appropriated or possessed by few and few individual, and majority of them live in the absolute dependent on the market forces or forced to sell their labor just for the survival. So, we will see in the concluding part of the lecture today the enduring legacy of Marx. So, let us start with this idea that Marx was a political philosopher, but he is a philosopher in a very distinct or unique sense. In that sense, for him the task of philosophy or philosopher is not just to help in the understanding or interpretation of the world. The primary and the major responsibility for a philosopher or a philosophy according to Marx is to develop the ways and mechanism to change it. So, the idea is not just about interpreting the world or understanding the world, but how to change it, and this change is to ensure the greater freedom for the individual, which capitalism necessarily deny to the majority of its member. So, for him the role of philosophy should not be limited merely to interpretation, but should develop the roadmap to change it or transform it. So, in this sense there is a kind of combination of theory and practice in Marx's philosophy, and much of his later works develop, particularly his work on Capital or Communist Manifesto, developed on the basis of his own personal political engagement with the working class movement in England or France and in other countries in Europe. So, there is a kind of then in his thought and theory combination of the ideas and theory with the practices, and the role of theory and philosophy then is not just in helping or making sense of the world, but also enabling the individual or the community to change it for the better, how to organize it in a rational manner that would ensure the maximum freedom for everyone and not just for few, as capitalism or the modern bourgeois revolution has done. So, in Marx you have this recognition of political revolution or liberal bourgeois revolution, which acknowledge the rights of every man. But in the absence of economic freedom or economic social rights, those freedoms are inadequate according to Marx for the majority of people to realize their freedom, to live their life the way they want to live. So, in that sense many took his philosophy as a call to action. So, the inspiration from Marx is not just to understand the world theoretically, but also to change it. And one of the reasons for his perception or acknowledgement as the theorist of revolution is also based on this fact that his works has shaped many historical and political events in the modern world. So, you can think of Chinese Revolution or Russian Revolution or in Cuba and in other places. They all derive inspiration from Marx's writings. So, one of the significance of Marx is not just his writings or his ideas that is contained in many of his writings, but also his influence on the actual event in the history. And it is on that basis there is the popular perception and also misperception or incorrect perception about Marx and his writings. So, being a materialist, Marx's lifelong pursuit was to understand the functioning of capitalism and the way exploitation and alienation happens in the capitalist mode of production, and what should be the means and mechanism to overthrow it. So, in the Marx writings, one thing is very sure and consistent is the exploitative nature of capitalism, the inherent contradictions in capitalism, which according to his historical materialist understanding must pave the way for the next stage of human history, that is communism. So, his lifelong pursuit is then not to understand the state or polity or laws or rights, but to understand the economic base of capitalist society, and on that basis how to create a condition of greater freedom or the freedom for everyone in the society. So, in Marx, primacy is indeed given to economy, and this we have discussed while we discussed his views on class and also historical materialism, the base superstructure model, where economy is seen as part of the base which determines the superstructure, and in the superstructure there is a polity, law, education, so on and so forth. So, in Marx indeed primacy is given to economy, and it has led many scholars to argue that there is no consistent theory of politics and state in Marx. So, unlike many thinkers that we have covered in this course, so you can recall social contract tradition thinkers such as Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, even Hegel or Kant. There is this acknowledgement of the role of a state, even in Machiavelli or Plato and Aristotle. But whereas in Marx, you do not find a very consistent theory. We have discussed it while we discussed his theory of a state, the primary view of a state as an instrument, and the secondary view there is a kind of autonomy, and yet it functions to protect the interest of the bourgeoisie. So, in Marx then you do not have a very thorough, consistent engagement with the idea of politics and state, and we will discuss that in fact in Marx you have a kind of anti-political approach. He did not consider politics as the base or as an tool to understand the real nature of any society. It has to be economy. So, that led many scholars to argue that there is no consistent theory of politics and state in Marx, and this is valid to a great extent, and Marx saw in politics and state as something which is the instrument of class exploitation. So, politics and state according to Marx is used in capitalism to protect the interest of those who possess the means of production, the propertied class or bourgeoisie. So, in his vision of future communist society, he argued that there would be no role of state or politics. We will discuss it in a minute. So, among the Marxist as well as non-Marxist scholars, there is a sharp debate about the characterization of Marx as a humanist or a revolutionary thinker. So, Marx's early writings, where he engages with the question of alienation and communism, are seen by many as true Marx, whereas they see his later works as betrayal from his early works. So, we have discussed while discussing his theory of alienation and communism that in Marx there is a kind of concern or primacy for human freedom. So, like Enlightenment thinkers in that sense, he was also trying to envisage a life or a rational social political order that would ensure the real freedom for everyone and not just for few. And according to Marx, capitalism deny that freedom for the majority. They are merely free to sell their labor. So, there is no real actual freedom for the majority of workers in capitalism. So, in his early writings, the primary concern was to ensure is or think of a social order that would ensure the freedom of everyone, and also human being while performing the labor should not be alienated from the labor, from the process of labor, from the product of their labor, and also from their fellow beings and their own species being. So, in Marx early writings there is this approach to understand the human nature in their real material conditions and think about a society or a polity that would maximize that freedom. Whereas, in the later writings of Marx, the focus is given to more a kind of scientific or deterministic kind of understanding of human history on the basis of modes of production, and that should necessarily lead from one stage to the next stage, and capitalism for him is not the final stage of history, which must pave the way for the next stage because of its own contradiction between the two classes, bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And this division of classes leads to conflict which is unsustainable within the capitalism, and therefore, the next stage is inevitable, which is communism, that would be a classless society. So, in this later writings of Marx, the focus is given to more on the scientific explanation or revolution or proletariat revolution and so on, and therefore, many confusion about Marx and his writings, whether he is the humanist who is thinking about human freedom or creating the condition for human freedom, or he was a revolutionary thinker who wanted to overthrow the capitalist state. So, for many writers, the true Marx then is there in his early writings, and later Marx is a kind of betrayal from that true Marx. However, much of Marx's perception in the 19th and 20th century is based on his later works, and there is the historical reason for that also, that the Marx that is popularly known is also associated with the popular revolution in 20th century, Chinese revolution or Russian revolution or Cuban revolution, and his early writings is known much after his works like German Ideology or Communist Manifesto or Capital. So, early writings such as Economic and Philosophical Manuscript is discovered much later after the popular perception of Marx based on Communist Manifesto, German Ideology and Capital. So, in that sense, for many of his followers, the true philosophy of Marx is contained in his later works, and that leads to some kind of debate and confusion about considering Marx as a revolutionary or a humanist thinker. But both these positions are somewhat inaccurate. The truth is, the problems that Marx first identified in his early works, he went on to develop them fully in his later years. So, how to prevent human alienation or to create the condition of human freedom or overcome the exploitation in the capitalist modes of production. These are some of the problems which he identified in his earlier works, such as Economic and Philosophical Manuscript. And in his later works as well, he developed much more scientific and deterministic outlook, but those problems he tried to develop it or overcome it through his later works, such as Communist Manifesto and German. So, there is no kind of fundamental break in Marx from early writings and later writings. Okay, so let us come to discuss his views on politics and communism, and ironically Marx, whose philosophy has shaped or influenced the politics of every society in the world, was essentially, like Plato, an anti-politics thinker. So, if you can recall our discussion on Aristotle, so there are different classes and different classes have different interest that leads to some kind of conflict, and the art and science of politics is to manage or mediate these social conflicts. It is there similarly in Machiavelli, where he also discussed that to sustain the republic, it is necessary to have different classes, and in fact in the institutional mechanism of republic to remain sustainable, it is necessary to have those social classes and their conflicts. So, the politics is to be seen as an art and science of mediating those social interest or social conflicts. In the Marx, which is similar to Plato, the role of politics is to harmonize or ensure the harmonious existence of human life. So, a theory of justice or life in the state, according to Plato, should be a kind of perfect harmony. It is similar to say Kantian perpetual peace. So, there is in Marx also then the ultimate or the final stage of history should be the perfect harmonious kind of living, where there should be no role of politics and state, and politics for him is to be seen as a kind of instrument of class oppression or class exploitation, and therefore his thought and philosophy shaped the politics of many countries, but himself Marx was a kind of anti-politics thinker. He did not develop a systematic theory of politics and did not consider politics as the basis of true understanding of any society or even any stage of human history. So, for Marx in the historical materialism we have seen the primacy or even the significance is not associated with the political aspect of that society or that historical change. For him, the real base for social economic change or transformation is the economy, and therefore for Marx to understand a society such as capitalism, one should understand its economic functioning rather than its political and legal promises. So, he did not develop a kind of systematic theory of politics, and according to him politics is not autonomous from the economic base, and it is the centrality or the primacy on which Marxist theory of state, politics and stages of history is based. So, according to Marx, politics has a role to play only in a class divided society, that is when the society is divided between those who own the means of production and those whose life depend on that means of production or working for them, those who own the means of production. So, along with the institution of the modern state, Marx saw politics as an instrument of class domination, and he argued that in communism, which would be the highest and the final stage of history, state along with politics would wither away. So, there is no role of politics, there is no role of state in the communism according to Marx, and the reason for that is that in the absence of private property, there would be no class, and if there is no class, there is no conflict. So, in a classless society, life would be free and harmonious, hence there would be no need for either state or politics to manage the class conflict. So, in the Marxist or Marx scheme of thing, in the communism, which is a classless society, there is no private property, there is no need of politics and state, precisely because in the classless society everyone would live the life of freedom, and there would be no conflict between individual and the social, man from one section to the other section, because there is no class, and if there is no class and no conflict, the life would be a kind of self regulating life or self managed life. There is no need of state or politics. So, Marx argued that the inner contradictions of capitalism and the law of history would inevitably lead to the next stage of development in human history which he calls communism, and communism according to Marx would be the final or the highest stage of history, and this, as we have discussed in Hegel, the movement of dialectics from one stage to the next stage of human progress, where Marx considered capitalism not the final stage of history, although it is the necessary which leads from the life of scarcity to life of abundance in terms of production and so on, yet it is inherently contradictory because of the class nature of the society. So, only the minority possess the maximum wealth, and the majority are merely free to sell their labor, dependent to work for those who possess the means of production. So, he was envisaging a kind of life where freedom is there not just for few, but for everyone in the society. So, communism according to Marx then is the final and the ultimate stage of history, because in the communism there is no classes, and in the absence of classes there is no contradiction, and if there is no contradiction there is no further movement in history. So, life would be like permanently peaceful, or perpetually peaceful, and everyone would live according to their abilities and work according to their need. So, now the question is how to bring about this transformation from capitalism to communism or revolution. So, the dominant views is that it would be through a revolution led by the proletariat, and this view is something which is perpetuated by Engels or later on Lenin and other Marxist writers. In Marx himself, you do not have a very conclusive explanation of the road to a revolution. It may be revolutionary, but it can be other ways of bringing about transformation in the economic conditions of life or the modes of production. According to this view, that the proletariat would bring about this transformation from capitalism to communism, it is argued that they would first overthrow the capitalist system or state and establish the collective ownership of the natural resources, and this transitory phase is called the dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, since all states according to Marx represent and protect the class interest, the dictatorship of the proletariat would too represent the interest of the workers. So, all forms of state according to Marx is representative of the class interest, and it work only to protect and perpetuate that class interest. It is true with the feudalism or slavery, or it is true in the capitalism. Similarly, the dictatorship of proletariat would also be a class state. That means, it would protect the interest of the working class. However, this dictatorship of proletariat according to Marx is different in a sense that unlike other forms of state, it is based on the will or interest of the majority and not minority. So, in the capitalism only the few controls maximum wealth, and thereby the rule or the state in the capitalism protect the interest of few. Similarly, in the feudalism and other forms of state, but the dictatorship of proletariat would be different because it would be representative of the interest or will of the majority, that is the workers, and they would protect their interest. So, after the establishment of this dictatorship of proletariat, they would abolish the institution of private property and work towards abolition of class itself. So, there would be no class of bourgeoisie and the proletariat and other conflicts that exist in the class society. After abolishing the institution of private property, the dictatorship of proletariat must pave the way for self-regulating modes of harmonious living in the forms of communism. So, that is the very crucial explanation in Marx, and that is also problematic, because in many societies, as we have seen historically when proletariat revolution have taken place, it did not lead to communism or classless society. So, like previous revolution from feudalism to capitalism, the old ruling class is replaced by new ruling class, and so is true with the communism or the communist revolution. However, Marx thought, and here he is somewhat similar to his critique like Hegel or Kant or Plato, which is much more kind of utopian or the idealistic approach, that the dictatorship of proletariat after capturing the power or abolishing the private property would eventually pave the way for stateless society or a classless society, which did not happen historically in the material real sense. So, however, according to Marx, life in the communism would be such that freedom of each will be the condition of freedom for all. So, there is a kind of complete in that sense union of self with the society, self with the community, self with the fellow being. So, the freedom of each is possible on the condition of freedom for everyone else. This slogan, however, is somewhat confusing in the sense that in the real material world, what does it mean is not clearly spelled out. Neither Marx nor many other Marxist scholars actually explain what does this term mean, that life in the communism would be freedom of each on the condition of freedom for all. So, it is a kind of projection or a kind of objective, but it does not have a very clear explanation of what does it mean to live a life in the communism and exercise that freedom on the condition that that freedom is on the basis of freedom for everyone else. Similarly, production would be governed by the logic of each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. This phrase is again from Saint Simon, who was a socialist thinker, and this idea of regulating the production or labor in the communism is fundamental in the communist living or understanding of labor, as he explained in his theory of alienation. So, production is then guided by the need of the individual and not the profit, and it is the profit which is the motive that leads capitalists to exploit the workers. When the production is based on the need, and while performing the labor, human being actualize his own self, then the society and its economic production would be on the basis of its need without exploitation. But when it is driven by profit, and profit for the sake of profit, not necessarily on the basis of need or the actual need of individual, then it leads to exploitation or conflicts in the society. So, production in that society would be based on the principle of each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. So, Marx recognizes essentially social nature of man. However, he does not want the individual to be subjected to the tyranny of society. So, in Marx, where there is this recognition that man realize his own true human nature while living in association with others. So, in that sense, it is a kind of Aristotle or other thinkers who argued that man is by nature a social animal. So, we develop our own self while living among the others. It is the capitalism which alienate us from the others, from from our friends, from our relationships and so on, where everyone and every relationship is transformed into commodity with its use value and exchange value and so on. Marx envisioned a life where individual would live in communion with others, and in living that life individual must not be subjected to the tyranny of society. So, it is a very different explanation in Marx, where the communal mode of living is recognized, or the social living for the individual is recognized, but individual is not subjected and limited to the tyranny of society or community. She should be free to express himself in whatever creative or intelligent way he or she desires. And in that sense, it is also different from the liberal and market views on freedom, that is based merely on your political and the legal equality or freedom. In the absence of real economic condition of life, materialization of such freedom is not possible. So, Marx developed a very unique sense of human freedom, and that is prevalent even in the community. So, human being live in association with others and yet express his own self, his own creativity, and the first condition for creating the communism is to ensure the maximum freedom. So, individual is not, according to Marx, a subject of tyranny by the society or community, which many proletariat revolution in different countries have practiced, where the state and the objective of the state is given priority over the freedom of the individual citizens. So, in Marx, the individual is not subjected to the tyranny of society, and he was also in favor of man women equality, and argued against the objectification of women as the sexual object. So, Marx's views on communism are based on the following four premises. First, he rejected the crude communism. So, crude communism, and prior to Marx there was many socialist thinkers, and there is a reason why Marx called his philosophy communism and not socialism. Prior to Marx, there is this thinking that private property is a kind of theft, Proudhon and many other socialist thinkers. However, the difference from their modes of thinking about communism to Marx is that for Marx the idea is not to bring everyone down to the same level, and the having the sense of enviness or possession as in the capitalism. He was thinking or envisaging a form of life where these values of possession or enviness would be absent. So, for him the communism is not crude communism, that means property should be divided among everyone equally, and all of them should continue to have the sense of possession in the absence of private property. Marx do not want that kind of crude form of communism where everyone should be at the same level, property should be divided equally, and so on. Second, for him workers as a class are the agent of revolution. So, the revolution and the transformation from capitalism to communism will be carried by the proletariat. Third, the abolition of private property and the establishment of the dictatorship of proletariat is a necessary precondition for communism, and this he differs from many socialist anarchist thinkers also. So, we will discuss Bakunin while we discuss the criticism of Marx theory on state later on in this lecture, but for Marx revolution from capitalism to communism necessitates the dictatorship of proletariat, whereas for Bakunin and many other social anarchists, all forms of state leads to the condition of unfreedom to the man, therefore should be detested. So, in Marx, for communism to bring about, it is necessary to establish dictatorship of proletariat that would abolish the private property. Third, the cooperative modes of living without the fourth. The cooperative modes of living without alienation and exploitation of man by man are possible only in a classless society without state and politics, and that is his idea of communism from capitalism through different stages. through a kind of transition by establishing the dictatorship of proletariat to a kind of cooperative living where there is no classes, no private property, and everyone lives according to his ability or according to his creativity without exploitation of man by man that characterize the capitalist modes of production. So, Marx was correct in explaining the existence of ruling class and ruled in every society. However, his conception of communism is as utopian or ideal as he accused Hegelian idea of state to be. So, in his theory of communism, he is as idealistic or utopian as Hegel and many other thinkers he accused of to be. So, historical experiences of communism in many countries have proved his predictions wrong, and capitalism not only survived and flourished, but communist regimes in many countries, instead of paving the way for communism, or the way at least Marx envisaged it, have perpetuated the worst form of tyranny. Now, we move on to the critical assessment of his thought. Marx's significant contribution to the history of political thought is theory of historical materialism, and this theory of historical materialism gives us a tool to understand the past and its various stages historically and materially. So, his emphasis on the actual and given or material existence of man as the basis of understanding the functioning of a society or its polity gives a new tool for social and political inquiry. So, understanding of society and politics is incomplete without understanding the real, actual or the material existence of man. So, he was a great materialist thinker, and it is clear from his assertion that the material existence of man determines his consciousness and not the consciousness that determines his material existence, and this is his sharp difference from Hegelian idea or Hegelian priority of idea over matter. Similarly, his interpretation of exploitation and alienation in the capitalist modes of production has shaped many historical and political events, and it is still relevant in explaining the periodic crisis in capitalism. So, there is a boom and burst in capitalism, and every time there is a burst, people go back to Marx and through them try to explain the next stage of history and so on. However, capitalism has so far not only survived, but it has every time resolved the tensions or the periodic decline. However, Marx's prediction that capitalism will destroy itself due to its inherent contradiction was wrong. It has been proven wrong historically, and capitalism not only survived but flourished in the previous 2 centuries. And revolution that Marx envisaged never happened in the advanced capitalist countries. So, he thought England or France with its working class having the ideal material condition to develop the class consciousness that he was talking about would lead to proletariat revolution. But in these 2 societies that revolution never actually happened. So, Louis Althusser introduced the idea of epistemological break in Marx's writing, which is similar to many other scholars who divide his work into 2 categories: young humanist Marx and mature scientific or revolutionary Marx, which we have discussed in the introductory part of this lecture as well. This division of Marx is also based on Marx's engagement with Hegelian thought in his early years and eventual drift away from that in his later years. So, in later years Marx stopped to use many of the Hegelian terms and use scientific economic determinism more as the basis of his theory, the practical material existence of life. So, his popular perception as a revolutionary or scientific thinker is also based on Engels' characterization of his philosophy. Working on and publishing Marx's unfinished manuscript after his death, Engels wrote that just as Darwin discovered the law of development of organic nature, so Marx discovered the law of development of human history. So, there is a kind of deterministic scientific theory associated with Marx and his philosophy, and according to that, capitalism must be overthrown by workers through a revolution. So, for many Marxist late 19th and throughout the 20th century, Marx writing was the scientific history or scientific theory that should necessarily lead to the next stage of human history, that is communism. So, first asserted by Engels and further perpetuated by Lenin and other revolutionary thinkers, this idea then becomes the basis of Marx as a scientific thinker, which is different from young humanist Marx, or Marx focused on human freedom, then his focus on the revolution. So, this becomes the basis of Marx as a scientific thinker or a revolutionary thinker who discovered the deterministic law of human history, and according to that, capitalism should inevitably pave the way for communism. Marx's understanding of two fundamental classes in capitalist society is equally incorrect. Certainly, if we think about the advanced capitalist society and its division of labor between the managerial class or the working class or white collar workers or blue collar workers, and also many intermediary identities such as religion, caste, language, race, ethnicity, that keeps the workers fragmented from developing what he called the international solidarity or the consciousness among all the workers. So, there is not just the presence of a large middle class which Marx never took seriously. In fact, the whole liberal democracy or the constitutional democracy is based on this middle class. They have interest in the maintenance of status quo. And if you recall our lecture on Aristotle, he also wanted to avoid the extreme of either the authoritarian or mobocracy or the rule of everyone. There has to be a kind of balance, and that balance is ensured by the middle class. So, for the stability according to Aristotle is based on the number of this or the proportion of this class in the society. So, he wanted middle class to be in more and more number to stabilize the democracy, and this is true in modern liberal democracies also. However, Marx do not give any significance to this middle class. Even the two classes that he talked about are mediated through many other identities which Marx did not take seriously, such as the identity of caste in the case of India or societies like India, gender, race, language, religion and nationality. Many scholars also question his consideration of the working class as the agent of revolutionary change. So, working class itself is fragmented on so many other identities. So, the working class is not a singular homogeneous category, and many hierarchies exist among them besides caste, gender, race, language, religion, nationality and ethnicity. There is also the organization of working class on the basis of white collar workers and blue collar workers and their respective positions in organization of production in modern life. So, there are today fewer takers of Marx's ideas such as economic determinism and the scientific theory of history, and that the proletariat should bring about the revolution. Very few scholars or thinkers take these ideas seriously, even the Marxist thinkers. So, the historical experience of proletariat revolution in many countries has proved Marx's theory wrong. He also failed to understand the historical significance of nationalism that was the ruling ideas during the 19th and 20th century, and it continues to shape the social and political imagination in the modern world. So, there is a lot of things which Marx did not take seriously or engage with critically, such as ideas of nationalism and so on. So, for many scholars, his views on communism were as utopian or ideal as perhaps Platonic ideas of harmonious living in the state, or Kantian ideals of perpetual peace, or Hegelian ideals of universal or absolute will in the state. So, while Marx accused them of being ideal or utopian, his own idea of communism was perhaps as utopian and ideal as theirs. So, Marx ideas that envy or desire for possession is the product of the capitalist mode of living, and that the man would overcome them in the communism have been proved wrong by the historical experiences. So, Marx thought that the human desire to possess and possess more than his neighbor is something which is the capitalist values. It would be overcome by the man in the communist mode of living. And Peter Singer, while many others also argued that human being is driven by the desire, and in Hobbes we have seen that how he characterized human nature as the self-regulating mechanism of desire and aversion. So, anything that fulfills his desire, he is attracted towards that, and he averts those which is a threat to his desire, threat to his life. So, many thinkers like Peter Singer, while assessing the role of Marx, has rightly argued that no matter how egalitarian a society is, there would always be a ruling class and rule with their associated privilege and obligation, and it exists in communism as well. So, communism does not lead to the ideal classless, propertyless society as Marx envisaged. Similarly, Marx's base and superstructure model is criticized by both Marxist and non-Marxist scholars. Antonio Gramsci and Louis Althusser, among many others, while they developed their ideas on hegemony and ideological state apparatus respectively. So, they question the economic determinism of Marx and acknowledge the role of laws, politics and ideology in legitimizing the power and sustaining the rule of the ruling class. For Marx, what sustained the capitalist modes of production or capitalist state is the ownership of bourgeoisie over the means of production, and therefore he considered laws, politics, state merely as the instrument of exploitation in the hands of bourgeoisie. Whereas these thinkers do realize the role of ideology, politics in not only legitimizing the power or sustaining the role of the capitalist class, but also in ways of developing the counter ideology or overthrowing the capitalist society. Similarly, Bakunin, a socialist and revolutionary anarchist, criticized Marx's philosophy as statist, which limits human freedom. So, there was a difference within international working class movement, where Marx and his followers recognized the primacy of a state or the dictatorship of proletariat as a necessary step towards communism from capitalism. However, Bakunin and many of his followers question this primacy of a state, and all forms of authority is a tyranny according to them. So, he considered Marx's philosophy as a statist, which is similar to a kind of liberal argument for a state and legislation, and through them bringing about human freedom and so on. So, Bakunin argued that if there is a state, there must be domination of one class by another, and as a result slavery. The state without slavery is unthinkable, and this is why we are the enemies of the state. So, similarly in the Marx also, when he talks about communism, he wanted to do away with the state. In the communism there is no need of a state according to Marx. He also realized, like Bakunin, the exploitative nature of the state. However, where he differs is that from capitalism to communism, it is necessary to establish the proletariat dictatorship. So, there is a kind of recognition in Marx for human emancipation, for ensuring human freedom, but for Bakunin those kind of assertion or establishment of the dictatorship of proletariat would necessarily perpetuate tyranny and bring about new kind of exploitation and new forms of authority over the individual freedom, and therefore they are against all forms of state and authority. Marx also fails to understand the frailty of human nature, and he thought human nature is not fixed and product of their material condition. Therefore, in the changed conditions of life in communism, they would develop new ways of association with themselves and their fellow beings. However, it is not entirely correct. For instance, the egoism and enviousness of men are not eliminated either in communism or with material abundance. So, his understanding of human nature then is also flawed in the sense that he thought certain values or principles which characterize bourgeois society or capitalist mode of production would not be present in the communist mode of living in the absence of private property in the classless society, but that is not historically true. So, the satisfaction of basic needs leads to the creation of more newer needs for the individual, and perhaps Hobbes and other classical economists are right that it is this drive for more possession or the desire to fulfill newer needs leads to progress and prosperity in the society, whereas for Marx it is a kind of stagnation or some kind of perpetuation of living in the communism. Now, if you look at the legacy of Marx, the uniqueness of his philosophy is that it provides not only the scientific analysis of the functioning of capitalism and its inherent contradiction, and also the basis of alienation and exploitation in this form, but it is also a call to create the condition of freedom for all, and that is the influence of Marx writing. So, it does not only explain and interpret the functioning of capitalism and the way exploitation and alienation works, but it is also a call to create the condition for human emancipation or real freedom for everyone and not just for few. And this has a tremendous influence on the political and historical events in the 19th century. So, Marx and his philosophy of communism inspired many revolutions such as Russian Revolution, Chinese Revolution, and in other countries in Asia, Africa and Latin America as well. So, many exploited or many countries took inspiration from Marx, and his theory of communism is seen as a kind of next emancipatory stage in the human history. Although these revolutions never occurred in advanced capitalist countries as Marx envisaged, it continues to inspire politics in many societies and countries for the greater emancipation of the whole humanity and not just for the few who possess the property, and the inequalities and disparities that exist even today continues to make Marx writings and interpretation relevance to understand them. So, Marx writing have a tremendous influence on the 20th century scholars, and his historical materialism and theory of alienation and exploitation in the capitalist modes of production continue to inspire many inquiries in various disciplines in social science and humanities. So, Marx and Marxism becomes a kind of methodological tool for any kind of inquiry in various disciplines in humanities and social science, sociology, political science, history and so on. In that sense, Marxism as a school of thought derives much of ideas and theories from Marx writings, but also question and go beyond them. So, there is also a kind of argument about post-Marxism without apology. So, they derive inspiration from his ideas, but they also question and go beyond the ideas prescribed by Marx. The political economy approach in various disciplines is based on Marx philosophy and giving primacy to matter and actual existing condition of human beings. Marx philosophy help us to see and interpret the world in a particular way. It is very different in that sense from liberal and market views on human freedom, state and politics as we have discussed. So, often we look at the economic disparities nationally and globally as well as the periodic crisis in capitalism. Marx's writings appear to be still relevant to make sense of our 21st century world. However, Marx should be treated as a philosopher and his writings must be subjected to criticism in the light of historical experience and circumstances. So, one of the argument that comes from many Marxist scholars and thinkers is that the historical experience of communism should not be seen as in accordance with Marxist vision of communism, which was very different than the actual practices in the communist or so called communist society in China, Russia and in other places. But the truth is that the Marx's own ideas and its popularity is also based on these revolution. So, it is not correct to attribute to Marx certain scientific or deterministic understanding and yet rescue him from the actual practices of his idea. So, like other thinkers, he should be seen as a philosopher and must be subjected to the historical experiences or the newer discoveries or newer understanding. And therefore, our understanding of Marx should not be in isolation or in separation from the actual experiences of communism in different societies or in different countries. So, if Marx's popularity is based on his association with those revolution or those historical and political revolution, then it should also be the basis or the ground of criticism against many of his ideas, which is fair. So, to conclude, we should look at Marx as a philosopher, as a thinker with many insights which help us to understand the society and the functioning of the society and the way exploitation works and the alienation and the way economic disparities are artificially constructed, how men exploit other men and what should be the ways and means to overcome them. But nonetheless, we should also subject many of his ideas in the light of historical evidences such as Hegelian influence on his thought or the influence of classical economist or the French socialist on his thought, and also the way it has been practiced in different communist regimes. So, on that basis we can develop the better understanding of Marx, but that should not restrict us to read the original works of Marx also. So, that is all in this lecture today. You can refer to these texts like Avenary, The Social and Political Thought of Marx, David Butcher and Paul Kelly, Political Thinkers from Socrates to the Present, and Gerald A. Cohen, Karl Marx, Theories of History, a Defense, and Cephalizha, Western Political Thought from the Ancient Greeks to Modern Times, David McClellan, Karl Marx, His Life and Thought, and also James Allen Rand on Politics, and Peter Singer, Marx, a very short introduction. So, these are some of the texts which you can refer to understand whatever we have discussed in this lecture today on Marx's views on politics, communism, and the critical aspect or the critical assessment of Marx's thought. Thanks for listening. Thank you all.